Welcome back, dear viewers, to the RPG Imaginarium, where here we seek to catalog the best traditional gaming stories the internet has to offer. Tonight we bring you a story of how just about anything can become a tabletop role-playing game setting. This is the story of Go Godzilla, and as usual, a link to the original will be posted down below. Hey TG, ready for story time? I hope so. Now a little bit of backstory before I make you fall headfirst into this dank crevice. October of last year, I had watched all of the Godzilla movies in a marathon in preparation of watching a pirated copy of Shin Godzilla. Since it only showed in a select few theaters, and I fell in love with it. At the time, I was also planning to run a D&D campaign, but I didn't know what on, so using a bit of homebrew and the Airship Pirate system, I made my own game, and around the middle of November, I DM'd the following campaigns. The first campaign was about 5 of my players as Japanese biologists, and the government as weird things have been going on with the environment. Whale corpses are washing up on the beaches and radiation is spreading through the sea in small pockets before disappearing. This fucked up the ecosystem around Japan quite a bit, so initially the campaign was really kinda boring. Several sessions in, I would have just let them go and see what weird shit is happening, and to see their reasoning for it. One player even voiced her concerns about the game, but I told her there was nothing to worry about, and I was just trying something new. None of them knew about the second game I was running. I told one of my friends about the campaign I was planning to do. You see, I was just going to have Godzilla be an NPC controlled by me, but after a long discussion with my friend, he convinced me to let him play in the campaign as Godzilla. Now before I go even further into the story, here was the system I set up. The session would work as turns in a sense. One session we would spend with the humans and they'd try and predict where Godzilla would pop up next. They would also have to deal with the Japanese politics along with international politics as well. Deploying the defense force and researching new ways to deal with Godzilla were also part of the game as well, as you'll soon see. The next turn, however, was a little bit different. Godzilla's turn in the beginning of the campaigns was a little bit strange. The session would mostly go with my friend, who I will be calling Frank, going around the ocean collecting energy and mutating. Frank would also have to stay under the radar of the Japanese/world governments. I would also like to point out that my human team didn't know of Frank in the other game. Made Godzilla a much more formidable foe in the end. Now for about 3 sessions I had my human players doing pretty basic work. They would go to a location, take samples, study it, and that's it really. Their theory was that the Fukushima radiation spill was really fucking things up in the ocean. And while they couldn't explain the disappearing pockets of radiation, they could explain the other happenings. Or so they thought, because while I had them fucking around with dead animal corpses, Frank was going on a fucking rampage. He was attacking nuclear subs like a fucking madman, stealing the precious cargo within, and in a very short amount of time he managed to rack up so much MP, mutation points, he believed he was ready for the reveal, and how fucking right he was. He starts by mutating into Godzilla's first form, seen in the movie, and moves into Tokyo Bay. Water begins boiling and a red substance is seen spreading throughout the water. My human team begins getting ready for what they think is just another job. The Japanese government starts evacuating citizens from the area due to reports of volcanic activity. My humans get to the scene in only an hour and to set up a small base to see what the fuck is going on. But soon reports and rumors of a giant creature make their way to base with the team is freaking the fuck out. Then a massive tail spouts out of the water and begins waving around. They all shit their collective pants and pack the fuck out of where they were before seeing Frank start to move into the water canals. Once they get back to HQ, they're immediately bombarded with questions by not only high-ranking officials, but the Prime Minister himself. They start trying to form a plan as Frank finally makes his way onto land. At this point, he's already evolved into Kamada-kun and is barreling down streets as fast as his legs will carry him. The local police try and stop him with various blockades and weaponry, but he makes all of his rolls and tells them all to fuck off with a headbutt to the everything. It's only when tanks begin to show up does Frank get serious. He charges a tank column at full speed, taking shots as he does so. While Frank is throwing tanks around like chew toys, the humans are trying to mount a full-scale offensive with helicopters in the works. The team is analyzing everything about Frank as he fights the tanks. Everything is very hopeful as the tanks are beginning to do a number on Frank since he's just a wee babe. It isn't until the helicopters arrive as Frank gets spooked and evolves into Shinagawa-kun. The team shits their collective pants again and the Prime Minister allows all forms of weapons to be used against Frank, And to make matters worse, Frank is running out of steam and needs to get the fuck out of there. He does manage to escape, albeit heavily injured. After Frank disappears under the water, the team is left with some breathing room to operate. The leader of the team, let's call her Anne, is ordered to work with the Prime Minister and barely manages to keep her job. The rest of the gang heads out to collect samples of Frank for analysis before discovering that everywhere he went is irradiated as fuck. Frank is fucking pissed. All he did was go on land to see new shit, but all these assholes begin attacking him. So in retaliation, he hits a nuclear power plant and sinks a shit ton of fishing ships, building up even more MP. At this point, the US and Russia is involved, and along with the team, set up a base of operations at the central government building and start getting to work theorizing about what the fuck Frank is until, after a little hinting, they figure out he's a radioactive and uses nuclear fission to function. Over the course of 2 sessions, they have planned and set up military forces at Tokyo Bay and other places of interest where they believe Frank will surface again. They also get a name to this threat: Gojira. Frank makes several more nuclear subs go missing and upgrades his current form. He can now shoot small plumes of smoke from his mouth. Neat. He begins moving back into Tokyo Bay. The team's predictions were accurate and Frank comes back ashore in Tokyo Bay, and with a fucking vengeance. The second he gets on land, he charges into a building filled with infantry and munitions, reducing it to a pile of rubble. Frank doesn't even get slowed down as he begins slaughtering civilians by the hundreds as they try and evacuate. You can imagine the horror when you're woken up in the middle of the night to see a giant monster rampaging through the streets, killing people by the dozens every time it moves. Anne and the Prime Minister try and keep the peace by lying to the public they have a way to defeat Gojira. But the public isn't buying it, as Frank continues his path of destruction towards Tokyo. The Defense Force is doing its best to try and halt Frank's path, but he seems to be unstoppable, until the artillery started to fire. Now, Frank was making his ridiculously easy wound save rolls, but artillery was strong. Really strong. And Frank was getting his ass pounded every which way. Infantry is advancing with a prototype rocket launcher made just to kill him. Red then fills the air as Frank begins to glow. His jaw unhinges and a plume of smoke bellows forth, covering the battlefield with the irradiated smoke. And in the dust, the figure of Frank begins to get larger and larger. The evacuation of Tokyo is going really goddamn poorly due to panic and looting taking place pretty much everywhere. Police are trying to stop what they can, but with all the chaos, they are hopelessly fucked. Anne and friends are starting to pack up as last they saw Frank was still heading towards Tokyo. The dust doesn't even have time to settle as a gigantic foot crashes into the ground below. Frank is now evolved into his 4th form, Kamakura-san. Helicopters, tanks, artillery, and bombers are now focusing all fire on Frank as he moves slowly into Tokyo, crashing into several buildings. America is moving their asses into gear and is deploying bombers. Russia is doing the same. Frank, with his newfound powers, unhinges his jaw and it splits apart. An absolutely gigantic plume of smoke bellows out from his mouth and into the streets of Tokyo. Many civilians are caught in the plume, including 2 of the team. Then Frank turns purple and his plume turns into a torrent of fire that lights all of the remaining smoke alight. Frank rolled so many fucking successes I tallied the damage to be a little more than half of Tokyo. But the carnage didn't stop there. As the bombers closed in, the fire coming out of Frank's mouth became smaller and smaller until it became a purple beam of death. Many more buildings were simply cut in half by the beam, and the city is beginning to look more like a pile of rubble than a city. 2 of the team die in the fire and another dies by a skyscraper falling on him. Only Anne and the computer guy are left. The Russian bombers got to the scene first and started shelling Frank with everything they got. This, of course, only served to anger Frank, and he began shooting his beam into the sky in an attempt to destroy the bombers. It wasn't until the American bombers got to the scene did Frank realize he was fucked beyond belief. The American bombers did miss the first few drops, but the next round of bombs caught Frank in his meaty thighs, crippling him. Frank's regen rolls were horrible, only managing to heal a little at a time as the bombers kept pounding him into the dirt. Meanwhile, Anne is meeting up with the ground forces in an attempt to collect the regrowing samples for study. The only problem is that the bombers aren't calling off the attack and the surrounding area as a death zone. Computer guy got the fuck out of the city. Aside from getting shelled to absolute hell, Frank has almost no nuclear power left in him, as that atomic breath is expensive shit. He begins panicking. He has Godzilla try to thrash around, but he finds that he can't move. I tell him to make one more heal check. 13 fucking successes. Fucking what? He manages to stand back up and he begins charging further into the city at a snail's pace. Luckily for him, however, the bombers go back to refill ammunition. Ground forces and Anne begin moving in as the bombers make their way to HQ. Their advance doesn't seem to last long as they see a very wounded Frank practically stumbling their way. Tanks are crushed underfoot and Frank's blood is getting on everything. Many soldiers die from the cascade of liquid falling on them, and the rest of the infantry move in to collect more samples. Except for Anne. Tanks are ordered to fire on Frank, and after a few saving rolls he tumbles back down to the ground again. Shells are actually penetrating him because of the bomber wounds. As Frank continues getting ass blasted, Anne walks in with a no man's land, causing the tanks to stop firing. Anne comes face to face with the dying Frank and just fucking goes off on him. She is literally screaming at a fucking god on earth as it takes its last breaths. That isn't the end though. She climbs on some rubble and starts kicking Frank. This halts the defense force long enough that after a good in-game half hour of kicking, Frank has healed. A lot. His mouth opens one final time and it goes from plume to fire to beam in an instant. He gets back on his feet and obliterates the tanks before turning back to Anne. Anne is crying and is still screaming at Frank, who is going into coma mode after expending too much energy. His legs give out and Frank crashes back down to the ground and crushes Anne. I decided to end the campaign there, as the only guy still alive got the fuck out of there. Frank joined us for the last session and I revealed that I was doing a campaign with him. The rest of the players were amused.